Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this interactive event, which is kindly supported by PGE, the Polish energy group. My name is Frédéric Sidon. I'm the Energy and Environment Editor of Euractiv, and I will have the pleasure of moderating today's event titled Offshore Wind Power, How to Unlock Necessary Investments. Today's debate on offshore wind comes just a few weeks after the European Commission published the strategy. Offshore wind capacity needs to be multiplied by 25 times by 2050 in order to reach the EU's climate neutrality goal. The question now, obviously, is how to achieve this. What changes in policy, in infrastructure, and within the electricity industry itself needs to happen in order to reach that kind of growth? To discuss this topic today, let me welcome Joachim Balker, Head of Unit at the European Commission's DG Energy, Giles Dixon, CEO of Wind Europe, Gerald Kindler, Vice Chair at NTOE, the European Network of Transmission System Operators for Electricity, and Wojciech Dabrowski, the CEO of PGE. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. We will start this event with some opening statements from each of the speakers, and then we'll move on to a Q&A debate that I will have the pleasure of moderating. We will also take questions from the audience, so don't be shy. You're welcome to use the Ask function on Vimeo to put questions to the panelists. I think that's all for me, so without further ado, Joachim Balker, the floor is yours.
Invitation and the possibility to say a few words by way of opening this conference. I hope that you can hear me well. Indeed, as you said, we published the offshore strategy very recently with a sort of rather ambitious objective at the heart of it. If I were to characterize how we see the development of offshore as it has to go forward, I would say that we definitely see that there needs to be a step change approach in the approach to rolling out offshore renewables. And the question that this debate is supposed to answer, how to attract the necessary investment. First, I think we need to be aware that this investment will really be at an unprecedented scale, and it will have to happen in an environment which is challenging in a number of respects. We're talking about an environment, the offshore environment, where we have relatively little in terms of pre-existing infrastructure. There isn't something like an existing highway network, if you like, which is already laid out. We're talking about an environment which is inherently multinational and hence multi-jurisdictional. So clearly, from a regulatory perspective, there are challenges to be addressed. And we are talking also about an environment which is clearly challenging in terms of the natural conditions which are out there. So if in this environment we are to make the investment happen, which will lead us to a rollout of offshore renewables in the order of 300 gigawatts in 2050, clearly this is a tall order. And this is why we came to the conclusion that an approach is needed, which, at least to a certain extent, sets an endpoint and defines what is needed from this ultimate want to be in 2050, and hence defines the process to a certain extent from the end, if you like. Why is that the case? Let me summarize that in sort of three points. First, because we think for this type of rollout, it is necessary to plan the space, because the space out there will be limited, and there is a need for a rational approach how to use it. Second, because it's necessary in advance that they will be available on time and to the sufficient extent, sufficiently integrated to allow to integrate all this offshore renewable energy which is needed. And thirdly, we also do need to think it is necessary to devise and clarify the regulatory rules, the framework, already now in a way that will allow all this 300 gigawatt to be integrated into the system in an efficient manner. Now, these are the key reasons why we thought it's necessary just to essentially set out the vision to make this 2050 vision happen, but to get us there by concrete steps, because we are of course aware that for the long-term vision to come takes in the short term is concrete investment by private investors, and we want to be sure that the conditions for this are in place. But again, against the background of a 2050 vision, which we think is necessary to always have in front to make that upscale happen. That's how I would summarize the offshore strategy, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Joachim Balker. I see Charles Dixon has not yet joined us, so I will jump immediately to Gerald Kindler from NISOs. Gerald, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to say a few words on behalf of that this paper features the fantastic features of the electricity system. First of all, there's an abundance of electric power available in the electric system of renewable. Power plants close to load centers. And in 2050, offshore wind far away from the load centers, as far as it can get. And those 300 gigawatts are going to be production, which again new locations to the loads, which is conventionally on the continents in the different load centers. Technology-wise, we have to break new grounds there. We have to space is really scarce. It's not only scarce on sea, even though it looks so vast, but it's also very different routes to bring the electricity to We wrote 2 position papers already on offshore wind, and but there's also another aspect I would like to talk about. We have to integrate this renewable power in the system, and their sector coupling or sector integration becomes before is that we do not have as much storage as integrate all this renewable power from the seas. into one of the topics later on during the debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Daryl Kindler. And let me turn now to Horstier Dabrowski from PGE. Horstier, the floor is yours.
Good morning, hello. Offshore wind energy is one of the pillars of PGE's new strategy until 2030. In 2030, the strategy in PGE portfolio to commission 2.5 gigawatts offshore wind, and by 2040 to achieve the total 6.5 milestone has been made to dedicate offshore wind support scheme in Poland. And November, the Polish Council of Ministers approved the draft Offshore Support Scheme Act. We are convinced that with introduction of this scheme, Poland will make a step forward to deploy significant renewable energy sources, to timely contribute to the EU climate and renewable energy targets. I hope that the Act will eventually enter into force in January next year, so that we will be recently, the European Commission has launched the EU offshore renewable energy strategy, as my previous speaker said. The Commission estimates that by 2030, the EU will reach an installed capacity of at least 60 gigawatts by 2030 and 300 gigawatts by we welcome acknowledgement that for the Baltic Sea, this potential accounts 9 the European Commission intermediate state between projects connected to the grid radially and the full model of meshed offshore grid. In our view, the European regulations should at first facilitate those connected radially to the strategy also consists of binding zones market design. At the moment, it's difficult to assess the impact existing capacity is connected to only one that binding zone. Is to involve all stakeholders in cooperation and dialogue at the earliest possible stage. Member states, the Commission, transmission system operators, and investors are ultimately bearing the biggest investment and financial risks. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dabrowski. I see Charles Dixon has not joined, so we can move straight to the Q&A now. And let me start with a question to you then, Mr. Dabrowski. You mentioned PGE's plans to deploy offshore wind in Poland by 2030 and 2050. Can you tell us how much coal this will allow to displace, to put off the grid?
As I have already mentioned before, by 2030, PGE intends to commission 2.5 gigawatts of new capacities in offshore wind, and to 2030 to achieve their total installed capacity of at least 6.5 gigawatts. This will bring PGE to 50% of the share of renewable energy in our portfolio. According to our strategy, joint PGE activities regarding renewable investment will offshore wind farms will make the most of this electricity. We perceive this area in two dimensions. First, providing for a grid infrastructure to actually connect our offshore assets for a grid to the inland grid. Second, to it's not responsibility of percent of funding under EU programs should be also allocated for this. However, in terms of development of inland, the European Commission to provide sufficient financial framework and intensivities not only for transmission system operators, but also for distribution system operators, under connectivity to support further grid modernization infrastructure. That's in our opinion.
Thanks, Mr. Dabrowski. One last question for this initial round. Are you satisfied with the way infrastructure grid planning is being done currently to make sufficient space available for offshore wind? Is happening at the purely Polish level, but maybe also in the way it's coordinated at the European level. Do you believe that is being done in a way that you're currently satisfied with?
We would like to welcome to Commission's view that so far no clear into account other sectors such as tourism and fisheries. However, it should have a clear priority. We also share the Commission's insights and further proposals market design and offshore opinion about new Commission plan.
Thank you, Mr. Dabrowski. Let me turn to you now, Gerald Kindler. Can you give us a bit more insight into the kind of planning which is currently going on at NSOE when it comes to offshore wind? Are grid operators on track with the infrastructure development that is required for the kind of growth that the European Commission is looking at in 2050?
Thank you very much. First of all, being on track when the process just starts is interesting. We have a complete new challenge that is not a challenge to park operator. And this planning is on very terminal technology, and we fully support this. So be active, but and implement policies at hand. Partly answers your question.
Yes, thank you, Joe Kendler. Maybe you can tell us the way you're going to do that planning when it's going to be clear where the offshore wind farms are going to be situated. How is the planning going to work? Are you, for example, looking at more joint planning between EU countries? How is that going?
The NSOE process for planning starts with scenarios per step, and they are internationally coordinated by all market, by NSOE with all TSOs, and they are consulted with all market actors. So this is a very broad view, and there we have to know do our planning based on that.
Thank you, Gerald Kindler. There was some small problems with the connection, so we didn't hear everything you said, but we got the general gist of it. I see Charles Dixon has now joined us. Charles, can you hear us? Oh, we can hear you. We cannot hear you. We can see you, but we cannot hear you.
Hold on.
Oh, there you go. We can hear you now, Giles.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
You can hear me. Good morning. I'm sorry I've had problems connecting.
That's fine. We just started the event without you. We went through the opening statements, and we were just starting with the debate. So maybe you can just jump in right off. We were talking about the grid planning, which is necessary to get all the offshore wind which is being planned under the European Commission's offshore energy strategy. We're talking about huge amounts of additional electricity now coming from these offshore wind sites, which are currently only just at the planning stage. So how do you think these should be integrated when it comes to grid infrastructure?
Okay, it's very clear that huge amounts that's the first and obvious. There's extensive between TSOs, country authorities. It requires significant investments not just in offshore grid connections, but of onshore grids around the landing points and further inland as well. It requires also coordination between governments and between TSOs in different countries, notably on the development of grid connections for hybrid offshore wind farms. When talking about hybrids, it's very important just to remind ourselves that hybrid offshore wind farms are a good thing. They save money because they entail a pooling of both generation and transmission infrastructure between countries. They save space in the sea because the more hybrid offshore wind farms we have with connections to 2 or more countries, the less total capacity of offshore wind we will need to build. And of course, hybrid offshore wind farms help improve energy flows between different countries in Europe. They bring new liquidity to Europe's energy market. So they are a good thing, but they require a very high degree of coordination between national governments, TSOs, regulatory authorities, and of course farms. It's very important that they should be treated legally as an asset class in their own right. Today in EU law, they are not. They are treated in the electricity regulation as a pure interconnector, and then they're treated in other parts of EU law as generation assets. They are both. They are generation assets and interconnectors and need to be treated as a sui generis standalone asset class. And we very much hope that the imminent proposal to revise the 10E regulation that the Commission are about to table will lead us in that direction, that hybrid offshore wind farms should be treated as a distinct legal category. That will help to facilitate investments in them. Other things are necessary also to facilitate investments in hybrid offshore wind farms. As things currently stand today, developers of offshore wind farms are not inclined to invest in them because they cannot see where the revenue is coming from, because they look at Article 16 of the EU electricity regulation as it stands, and they look at the 70% rule, and they say, well, the electrons we're going to be producing from our hybrid offshore wind farm are going to get squeezed out. And so what is the revenue perspective? Now, the Commission recognise this problem and of course are moving to tackle it, and the offshore renewable energy strategy takes us many steps forward in this direction. We have the concept of offshore bidding zones, which seems like a good way forward, but still there needs to be some redistribution of congestion income in order to ensure that the developers of hybrid offshore wind farms have a stable revenue perspective. Otherwise, I'm afraid they simply will not invest in them and will lose all the benefits that I described earlier. the European wind industry actually think that out of 300 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity, 1/3 or 100 gigawatts could and should be hybrid offshore wind farms by 2050. Thank you.
Thank you, Giles. Can you maybe expand for us and explain this issue about congestion income? Can you explain what the problem is currently and how regulators and the European Commission potentially has proposed a solution to that?
Yeah, so it needs an amendment to the EU electricity regulation. The Offshore Renewable Energy Strategy talks of bringing forward such proposal by 2022. As things stand, all of the income goes to the TSOs. The TSOs themselves recognize that the developers of offshore wind farms need to have a revenue perspective, and that probably involves looking at how congestion income is distributed. And the most recent paper from NISOs acknowledges this. But it does need this change in law. A proposal only in 2022 is quite late, because there are many hybrid offshore wind farms that the industry want to take forward now, and that national governments and TSOs want to take forward. In particular, the three governments of Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, with their respective TSOs and their respective offshore wind farm developers, are talking really at quite an advanced level and quite a detailed level now about specific hybrid offshore wind farms, but they won't take a final investment decision on these projects until the legal framework is clear. So the sooner the Commission can table a proposal, the better. Of course, it will then go through the co-decision process. It will take some time to be agreed. In the interim, there are many hybrid offshore wind farms that will want to take final investment decision, and we were very pleased that in the accompanying document to the Offshore Renewable Energy Strategy, the Commission very clearly says that developers of these very early hybrid offshore wind farms can apply for an exemption from Article 16, and I think that is the route that many of them will take.
Thanks, Giles. Maybe a last comment before I turn to one of the other speakers. Wind Europe has highlighted a number of times already the issue about very long permitting procedures to get new wind farms built. It's even longer, these procedures, when it comes to offshore wind. I hear about up to 10 years. When it comes to offshore wind farms. So what kind of changes do you think are necessary now in terms of regulations in order to keep pace with the kind of deployment that the European Commission has put on the table for offshore wind, looking to 2030 or 2050, and even for 2030 is around the corner almost?
Well, indeed, that's right. The existing Renewable Energy Directive requires all member states to have a one-stop shop for the decisions on permits for individual renewables projects, whether it's wind or solar or anything else. Most member states are still not applying that. They have to be applying that from June 2021, when these rules come into force. The directive also requires final decisions on permits to be taken within 2 years of the initial permit application. Again, most member states are not yet applying that. So the Commission has a real job to do to enforce its own rules here. Okay. Now, some member states do have the one-stop shop. The Netherlands, for example, has a single regulatory authority, which is doing a very good job in expediting the award of permits for offshore wind farms. In Germany, it is less efficient at the moment, but both the permitting authority involved, the BSH, and the federal authorities recognize that, and measures are being introduced to speed things up. There is, I'm afraid, a headcount issue here. It might sound very simple, but in many of these permitting authorities, there are not enough civil servants to process the growing volume of permit applications. And of course, you know, one permit application is quite complex. There's a lot of paperwork involved. And governments have to make sure that they have got the right number of civil servants with the right qualifications working in their permitting authorities. For the hybrid offshore wind farms, having a standalone legal category in the 10E regulation will help, because then the special deadlines for the PCIs would come into force.
Right, thank you, Charles. Let me turn to Joachim Balker now from the European Commission. Very generally speaking, I mean, we heard from different speakers all the challenges that the industry is now confronted with when it comes to deploying much bigger amounts of offshore wind capacity. How will the Commission now follow up on the offshore wind strategy? What are the kind of different work streams that you have planned ahead of yourself in order to follow up on that strategy in the coming year?
Yes, thanks a lot, Frederick. Indeed, the strategy, of course, can be only a start, and the key will be now in implementing. And I think I would like to build on what many of my predecessors have said. I think one key purpose that we have is basically to reduce risk for those who have to invest and to increase clarity for those who invest in terms of the framework. Now, in that context, of course, one track which has been alluded to a couple of times is obviously the legislative track regulation. That is classically what the Commission is doing. And we have indicated a couple of avenues in that sense, where we will follow up on the strategy through legislation. And it has been mentioned a couple of times, the 10E regulation is the next candidate, is the next legislative project. And here I just want to underline that we really see a key role in the 10E review, enhance the system of offshore grid planning as we have it, because we do think that that is actually one key tool that we have, if you like, to reduce this risk. Because if we can come to a system which perhaps a bit more efficiently than today plans the grid and ensures that sufficient grid offshore and onshore, but in particular offshore, is available on time for those additional generation capacity to be connected and to be able to export the electricity to the load centers, that we believe will be one key factor to investors. So clearly this legislative track is key, with the 10E being next. And in the course of next year, there are then other pieces of legislation on the table, such as the Renewables Directive, which can then complement those rules. But it is not only legislative that we, in a legislative manner, that we plan to follow up. We do also think it is quite important to enhance, let's say, the dialogue between all actors. Another thing that has been mentioned here, if we look at the necessary industrial scale-up that we will need, and of course we would like to have this in Europe as much as possible to be able to produce the nets, which will get us the capacity out there. Here, we really want to intensify the dialogue through the Clean Energy Industrial Forum by not only, let's say, reviving and intensifying it, but also by giving it a more offshore-specific character through a specific offshore group, which will bring together the actors, both private actors, but also public administration, to really identify what are the key missing links, if you like, in the upscale of the value chain. And then lastly, I would also like to mention the work in the regional high-level groups, which has been very important in informing the offshore strategy, but which we want to pursue for its implementation. There is, of course, the North Sea group, which in a sense has been the pioneer, but from PGE already that there is a very high interest now in the Baltic Sea area. And indeed, one sort of key focus area is the Baltic Sea region, where we do, in a sense, operationalize the political support for a joint development of offshore renewables and offshore wind in the first instance. That has been shown in this region through the political declaration adopted at the end of September. But I do want to say that, I mean, these are the regions which have, in a sense, already a clear framework and a clear perspective. We do think that this can and should be emulated also in other sea basins, more in Southern Europe, the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, but also the Atlantic Sea basin. Similar possibilities for cooperation on a regional level, and here we want to continue cooperating with member states to shape that. I think these are the three sort of main strands in terms of the follow-up.
Thank you, Akin Balke. A question coming from the audience here about the suggestion in the Commission's offshore strategy to create a specific offshore bidding zones. Can you explain what is the Commission's intention there? Is there legislation coming up from the European Commission on this topic? And maybe more fundamentally, what problem are you actually trying to solve with that?
That question, indeed, a lot has been said about the offshore, and I want to indeed say a few words about this as well. I do hope you can still hear me because my picture is frozen, but I will continue. So, I mean, here, first of all, again, I think what we have to keep in mind is that we want to achieve a system which is overall efficient with a view to the enormous rollout of up to 300 gigawatt. Now, what does this mean in terms that we will need? I would like to actually agree with what the colleague from PGE said earlier on. There will be a panoply of different projects. National projects will continue to play a role. There are those projects which are now in the water, and there will continue to be national projects. This being said, all assessments and studies that have been looking at the perspective of this rollout show us that an overall efficient picture will include, next to national projects, also more integrated projects, hybrid projects from Dixon. These have advantages in terms of economic efficiency and also the efficiency of space use. And that is why in some circumstances, these will be a part of the efficient rollout of this offshore capacity. Now, it is specifically with regard to this hybrid projects that we have reflected, and not only reflected, consulted, what would be the right way to integrate them into the market in an efficient manner. And here, when we talk about efficiency, we think both of efficient signals for investment and as well at an efficient way in which they will operate. So how to ensure that basically the electricity they will produce, and this will be really a lot, will flow to the centers where they're most needed, to the markets where they're most needed. So I think this is the overall reflection. Again, how can we devise a system which achieves that in a perspective that is clear also in the longer term, that is fit for upscale, so which delivers investor certainty, and ultimately which has to be, of course, compatible with market rules and also with competition law. And here, indeed, the concept of offshore bidding zone does come in, but specifically for those hybrid projects, I would underline. They do have, in our view, they do fulfill this criteria of being efficient and providing also this long-term perspective how to enable this capacity in the internal market in an efficient manner. As has been mentioned, we have also recognized that there are in certain cases, that there can be certain need, let's say, to address the incentive structure. Again, as a very first thing here, I would underline the necessity to ensure that the grid is there at a sufficient level in time. I think this is the key factor really to mitigate the risk for investment, also for hybrid projects. But beyond this, the elements that Charles Dixon has mentioned are of course also relevant, and this is why we have indeed then also proposed of congestion rents. But again, it should be seen in the larger context, in the context of a medium to long-term rollout of an enormous amount of capacity, which has to be integrated in an efficient manner in the internal market.
Thank you, Joachim Balker. Let me maybe ask a reaction here from Gerald Kindler about this idea of creating offshore bidding zones. What is NSOE's views on this? Do you believe this could indeed help with the development of new offshore wind farms? Is this something that you support at NSOE?
First, thank you. And Joachim, you said the grid has to be there first. And I just would like to remind everyone that the investment volume for the grid is not as high as for the offshore wind parks themselves, but it is in a similar range, not quite as high, but it is high as well. And so we need a stable system. And then coming to your question with the bidding zones, first, what we need as TSOs is a stable regulatory framework and stable system framework, so we know what we can do, how we can plan the grid, and how we can invest. And in regards to this issue, there are two concepts on hand. One is the bidding zone concept, and the other one is the home market concept. As Joachim said, the bidding zone concept seems to be more efficient, but you have to recognize that this indeed lowers the revenue for the wind parks, because they will feed the electricity to the zone where the price is lower, and the home market concept actually leads to a little bit higher income for the offshore wind parks. So, NSOE perspective, yes, the bidding zone market looks more efficient. But for us, first of all, it's a policy decision, and for us, it is important that we have a policy decision and that we can plan the grid and implement the grid accordingly.
Thanks, Gerald Kindler. Let me stay with you for a follow-up question. There was this idea expressed before that some kind of arrangement when it comes to profit sharing needs to be agreed between the developers of offshore wind farms and the developers of the infrastructure, the grid. So can you maybe expand there on your views on how you believe cooperation there should be enhanced, and the kind of profit sharing that you believe is acceptable from the point of view of the grid developers?
First of all, this is again a policy decision, and I think profit sharing is the wrong term. What we see is when we have limited capacities, we auction today, usually onshore, we auction the capacities. And those and the income that we have from those auctions are then usually reduced either for projects, for international projects, or to reduce the overall fees for the customers. Now, when we are talking about offshore and having a hybrid setup or a setup that connects wind farms as well as several countries, then you run into a quite complex system, and then you will have first of all costs for the grid, and secondly you might have incomes from congestions. And this is not a profit, that's again a distribution of costs. And I would at this point say this is a policy decision, and I would be careful because it's not profit sharing, it is just a question, how do we finance the wind farms? Will the wind farms be just market driven? Will they get a subsidy scheme, as it is the case in many countries? And how will the grid be financed? And how will you work with the with some revenues due to congestions? And I think it's important that the policy finds a coherent answer for that, because this is needed for once, as Charles said, for the investments in the wind farms, and secondly, it's needed for clear investment signals for the TSOs to invest in the connections and into the interconnections. And this all has to go hand in hand. And I would not like to single out one of those elements at this stage.
Thank you, Gerald Kindler. Let me turn to you, Wojciech Dabrowski, with your views from where you stand in Poland as PGE about offshore wind bidding zones. Is that something you believe will help bring forward some new projects for offshore wind? Is that something that you would welcome?
Okay, as the previous said about hybrid, that taking into account the fact the offshore wind sector in Poland is at the early stage of development, there are no hybrid projects considered right now whatsoever in Poland. As I previously pointed out, the Polish offshore sector awaits for the national support scheme to become effective. Thus, our most advanced projects in 2030 perspective don't constitute hybrid projects. At the same time, at the end of September, that Mr. Kindler said, Poland, the European Commission, and 7 other countries of the Baltic Sea region signed the Baltic Declaration for Offshore Wind Energy. The activities are identified in the declaration by the signatory parties, also acknowledge the development of hybrid projects. With regard to regulatory aspects, beside those I have already mentioned, we believe that successful implementation of hybrid projects may, after all, require regulatory changes in the EU market design and electricity market regulation, especially in terms of 70% obligation. Our preliminary assessment leads to conclusion that without derogating from the 70% obligation, transmission system operators may have to limit generation, and investor would not be guaranteed electricity evacuation, thus putting a risk on revenue stream. This issue is particularly important when it comes to obtaining external financing. The long duration of this type of investment means that investors must be sure on conditions of operating in the energy market long before actual construction. That's it's our point of view.
Thank you, Mr. Dabrowski. Giles Dixon, let me turn to you now about this question about sharing of profit. There's no other expression I can find, I'm sorry, even though Gerald Kindler doesn't like this. Gerald Kindler said, this is up to the regulators ultimately to decide how the benefits of and the costs as well of those offshore wind farms be distributed between the grid developers and the project developers. So would you welcome an initiative on the policy makers' side in order to set that into some into stone, to have some sort of guidelines, maybe in the 10E regulation, as to how this should be done at a European level?
Yes, we would welcome an initiative from the Commission in that direction. The profit sharing we're talking about here, I think, is for the hybrid offshore wind farms, where you have the particular issue with the offshore bidding zones and the need to give the investors in the hybrid offshore wind farms greater clarity about their revenue perspective. Let's leave hybrids to one side and look at offshore wind farms more broadly. All investors in offshore wind farms want to have a perspective of stable revenues. And it's very good that the Commission strategy, and in fact, most national governments now recognize the importance of this. Most governments in Europe, including the Polish government, are using two-sided contracts for difference as the basic form of revenue stabilization for offshore wind farms. Gerald used the word subsidy, and I'm sure a very loose and generic sense earlier, but these revenue stabilization mechanisms are not subsidies, because governments pay out, yes, when the market price of electricity is lower than the winning auction price, but governments get paid back when the market price of electricity is higher than the auction price. The offshore wind farm owners and operators pay back the difference to the government. And this has proved an extremely effective model in those countries that have used it so far. It's proved to be pretty cheap for governments as well. Crucially, it has driven down the costs of finance. Now, offshore wind is capital intensive. You invest a huge amount of money up front before you've got any revenue. So minimizing your financing costs is absolutely key to minimizing the total costs of that offshore wind farm, total lifetime costs. The banks like lending to projects that have a two-sided contract for difference because they see 15 years of stable revenues. They know they're going to get paid back. They do not like lending to projects that only have a perspective of market revenue. And then equity investors need to come in, and the cost of investing equity is higher than the cost of investing debt that you've borrowed from a bank. The difference in financing costs between a project with a CFD and a project that only has market revenue is so great that the levelized cost of electricity from the former, that's the project with the CFD, is 50 euros a megawatt hour over the lifetime of the project. The levelized cost of electricity from a project that only has wholesale market revenue, say it's bid into one of these zero premium auctions that they have in the Netherlands, the levelized cost of electricity there is 92 euros a megawatt hour. So getting your revenue stabilization mechanism right as a government, ideally having contracts for difference, is crucial in minimizing the total costs of offshore wind.
Gerald Kindler, I see you're asking the floor. Please go ahead.
Giles, please apologize for using the term subsidy. Support scheme or so is much better. You are absolutely right there. I apologize. And I would like to stress the points that you make. To put stability in the market lowers the interest costs. And as offshore wind farms, as well as the connections, are mainly capital expenditure. It's extremely capital intensive. It must be the objective of the policies and the regulators and the member states to keep capital costs down. So it's really a tricky part of reducing the risk. So the banks give good loans and equity investors are likely to invest. And on the other hand, to provide some efficiency impulses. I think this is the tricky part policymakers have to find. And again, you need a lot of money, you need equity, you need loans, and therefore a stable investment regime for the grids as well for the offshore wind farms is needed. And I fully agree in that regard to Giles. Yes.
Thank you, Gerald Kindler. Let me maybe now turn to the European Commission and Joachim Balke about these contracts for difference. Giles Dixon says they make a huge difference for the investors, for the banks providing the lending. What is the Commission's view on that? Should they be encouraged and promoted further at a regulatory level?
Yes, thanks. Let me indeed say a few things about that. I think it is simply a reality that today those projects we see going forward in the offshore wind sector, they are by and large underpinned by, let's call them, revenue support schemes, indeed. And the two-sided contracts for difference is a popular type. Let's say they are similar types. I think what is key for us, for the Commission, and that's also the key criteria then under the state aid approval, is that these schemes are indeed market oriented, and that let's say the level of support that is needed, or let's say the level of revenue that they require, and that needs then to be stabilized if we want to stay in that wording, that is determined basically by a competitive system. And that is the case for those support schemes. That is why quite a number of them have been approved under state aid rules. The rules allow for that, and that is indeed today the reality of how the vast majority of those projects. And it's of course perfectly legitimate that. This being principle, we would also like to envisage a way how to enhance, let's say, the attractiveness, I would say, of the market as such to invest in such projects. And here, first of all, I would come back to the clean energy package, which aims at making investment conditions in principle, or let's say the market rules, more attractive for renewables producers. And what is perhaps also important is to try, and here I would like to make the link then with the whole question of sector integration, to attract, at least in a medium to long-term perspective, additional loads, such as, for example, electrolyzers, which would help us with power to gas, in a context where there is going to be at some point really a huge abundance of electricity generation at very low marginal cost. So I think one element that, going beyond the question of the CFDs, we should also keep in mind is how can we design the market. There is an interest for additional load to come into those areas where this abundance of generation, in order to stabilize the market price. I think that's also one element we should keep in mind. And then perhaps one last element, we're talking about bottom fixed offshore wind, mainly in the North Sea and increasingly in the Baltic Sea context, where such projects are fortunately today eminently investable, I would say, with the CFD, for example, and that's good. But our offshore strategy also goes beyond that and aims also at making other projects investable, other technologies, such as, for example, floating, investable on a commercial scale, and also ocean energy technologies, which we shouldn't forget, because those will be relevant in other sea basin contexts. And here, perhaps in particular, I would then also point at the complementary role of, and I'm not talking only about grants, but perhaps even in the first instance, also loans through InvestEU, because if we look at let's say the first bottom fixed offshore wind projects which went forward, it was very much also with the help of institutional investors such as the EIB that it was possible to crowd in private investment and the banks. And I think that is something that we would like to emulate for other technologies going forward, such as, for example, floating offshore wind. So I think here we would then also see a particular role for, let's say, financial support or at least loans on a European level to, as I said, to sort of broaden the investment possibilities.
Thank you, Joachim Balke. You alluded to the use of excess wind capacity when the grid is already full or when there's not enough demand to produce green hydrogen using this extra offshore wind capacity. Do you think a special category should be created there? Because these assets, they can be considered as storage, or they can be considered as generation capacity. So they have a bit of an ambiguous stance. Does the Commission plan to clarify this at some stage or give a special status to those kinds of assets?
I don't know if the biggest issue here at the moment is the question of a special status. I mean, when we talk about the electrolyzers, I think what is and power to gas. I think what is key here is first of all to let's say to bring the technology further so that it can be used at a bigger scale. That is something that we have. Where we have set sort of concrete objectives in the hydrogen strategy. That is something for which we think a further push will be needed. And then secondly, I think what we would like to bring forward also through the 10E is to go forward in the push towards a more integrated infrastructure planning, which takes the interactions between the different strands. We have today still a relatively sectoral planning for electricity, for gas. I recognize, of course, fully. Gerald will confirm this. We have in this TUINDP for the first time common scenarios. This is very positive, but this way needs to be pursued further. We need to further integrate the infrastructure planning. Today we have it between electricity and gas. But going forward, indeed, also including hydrogen, because we think that is the precondition, the key precondition for coming to an overall efficient energy system planning.
Okay, and maybe one final follow-up before I turn to you, Giles. The European Commission, I think next week, will present its proposal for the new 10E regulation. Broadly speaking, how does the Commission intend to promote, encourage cross-border projects, like we heard Giles describing those kinds of hybrid projects? Is there some sort of template that the European Commission is thinking of when it comes to putting together such types of projects? Because it raises all sorts of legal issues currently, and it seems there is quite a bit of demand to get some clarity on this. So is the Commission planning some sort of template for those types of projects?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of things which you need to be addressed in order to go forward with this, with the development of these more integrated projects. Some of which we will try to address through the 10E to the best of our abilities. Others will have to be addressed through subsequent either legislation or other forms of action, as I pointed out earlier on. I think in the 10E, the focus is clearly going to be on the issue of grid planning, because that is, in a sense, the core. I mean, of this particular instrument, and the idea that, as we've tried to sketch it in the offshore strategy, we need to come, in our view, to a somewhat more integrated regional level grid planning, in particular for the offshore sea basins. I think that's going to be the key element that we will try to address through this particular instrument. There are then a number of other issues which have to be addressed. Most of them, I think, have been named today. I just want to add one, which I think hasn't been so far mentioned today, which is the question of how to share costs and benefits around such integrated projects between the economic actors involved, but to a certain extent also between member states involved. This is a relatively complex question, but it is one where we hear again and again something in the way of a guidance from the side of the Commission would be helpful and perhaps even needed to address this in a more systematic manner, which goes a bit beyond a project-by-project approach. So I think this question of how to share costs and benefits between all concerned parties in an equitable manner is another element that we will try to address as quickly as we can.
Thanks, Joachim Balke. Giles Dixon, you were asking the floor just now. Please go ahead.
Two very quick reactions to what colleagues have said. First, it's very good Joachim mentioned floating. Floating is ready for scale up to very large commercial scale projects. France will run an auction for a 250 megawatt floating offshore wind farm next year. The more floating we develop, the quicker the costs will come down. We think we will have 7 gigawatts of floating operating by 2030. And at that point, the costs will be very close to the costs of bottom fixed conventional offshore wind. And at that point, you can use contracts for difference for floating in the same way that you use them for bottom fixed offshore wind. Secondly, Frederick, your question about offshore wind farms being hydrogen offshore wind farms or electricity, you want to keep as much flexibility as possible there, probably. Many offshore wind farms will be looking to feed into both markets. This year's Dutch government auction was won by Shell and Eneco with a firm offer that some of the electricity they produce from that wind farm will go towards electrolysis and renewable hydrogen, but not all of it. There will be some exceptions. So Saipem are developing a 450 megawatt offshore wind farm in the Adriatic, which will be exclusively for hydrogen production. And there will be other examples as well, but keep it as flexible as possible.
Joel Kindler, maybe you have reactions as to this idea of keeping flexibility for hydrogen or electrolyzers assets. What is your view from NSOE's perspective when it comes to that question?
Thank you, Frederick. Before you said you should use the excess wind energy for sector coupling, and first of all electricity produced by renewables that you can actually use in the electric system should be used there first. So when you cannot use this electricity anymore, either because there's just no load, because the installed capacity of the renewables is just much higher than the load, or because there are grid constraints, then it makes sense to couple the different sectors. And the Commission operation, which goes beyond, which means power to heat, to make best use on the industrial sides, power to vehicles, so to mobility, and then also power to gas. And all those things have to be considered together. Gas and their hydrogen has one very specific characteristic. It can also be transported for long distances, and there is existing infrastructure, and as the gas experts say, infrastructure that can be converted to hydrogen infrastructure with relatively little money. So there is another option that you have to check. Is it more efficient using electricity infrastructure and building electricity infrastructure, or using the excess wind energy and then transport it via existing refurbished gas infrastructure? And NSOE, in their planning scheme, as pointed out by Joachim Balke, has two steps. The first steps, in the scenarios, we look if the capacity of the load, if the capacity of the generation fit together, and this in all sectors. And in addition, we also have, at a later point, we look, after the projects have been planned, which is the most efficient project, and we do it with a multi-sectoral CBA. So going into those steps is really, sorry, all the communication here, and doing those steps is really most important. First, look at the scenarios together, and then assess which projects are best. Is it just electricity or is it gas? And this is the way where you have to go.
Thank you, Gerald Kindler. Let me turn to you again now, Wojciech Dabrowski, about plans which are being mooted right now to get more electrolyzers out there next to offshore wind farms to produce green hydrogen when there's excess capacity available. Is that something that you're looking into at PGE?
I said that before 2030 we intend to new capacities in offshore, and by 2040 to achieve their total installed capacity of at least 6.5 gigawatts. This will bring PGE to 50% of the share of renewable energy or our portfolio. That, if you allow, because we are discussing about investment costs and challenges and plans, that we didn't talk about energy prices, and we can't forget it. If you allow, in our view, increasing share of renewables leads to eventual decline of wholesale electricity prices for countries with not yet developed offshore wind sector. Support schemes are necessary to bridge this technology. The Commission ensures that the upcoming revision of the state aid rules will take into account an upgraded framework for offshore cost-effective development. In this context, it is important to emphasize the importance of ensuring the possibility of granting state aid through competitive tenders. For member states at an early stage of development of this technology, other more flexible rules should also be allowed. When strict criteria are met, such as the possibility of granting direct support without the need for a competitive procedures. I'm sorry, but I have to talk about this.
Okay, thank you. Is it generally speaking, is it fair to say you have concerns related to the fact that electricity prices are currently too low to generate the kind of investment that would be needed in order to get this new generation capacity out there? Is this correct?
Yeah.
And the contracts for difference are meant to be helping in this direction.
Yeah, we need to system of we need to help of EU and different plans to start to produce the electricity in the offshore.
Thank you, Wojciech Dabrowski. Let me ask the question to you, Giles Dixon, maybe. If wholesale electricity prices are too low and contracts for difference you see as one of the main tools to address this, should that be codified in a way at the European level, or is that something that the member states should be left entirely free to choose?
As things currently stand, Frederick, governments that are introducing and applying contracts for difference schemes are confident that wholesale electricity market prices will be at a level that will make those CFD schemes affordable. Some even think that they can be breaking even, if not even making a profit on their CFD schemes. So they are very confident about the outlook for wholesale electricity market prices. When you talk to banks and other financial institutions, they are fairly confident as well, certainly for the next 10, 15 years. Longer term, who knows? As Joachim said earlier, it'll be important to ensure that the CFD mechanisms remain market-oriented, which they are. There's a competitive bidding process. Poland is going down this route, at least after its initial projects for which it was judged there wouldn't be a sufficient level of competition, but ultimately there will be to support the CFD schemes. As things currently stand, it's the right direction to be going in. And of course, we'll always need to keep a close eye on the evolution of market prices.
And can you explain why is there such confidence that these schemes will be able to turn a profit in the long term? Is this because there is confidence that the price will rise eventually in the not too distant future? Is it linked maybe to the price of CO2 on the carbon market? What is it that creates this confidence in those contracts for the long term?
Well, I think it's those two factors, Frederick, plus also underlying confidence in the competitiveness of offshore wind as a form of power generation. You know, the costs have fallen hugely in the last 5 years. In Northwest Europe, offshore wind is now the second cheapest form of new power generation capacity, behind onshore wind.
Right, thank you, Giles Dixon. I'm afraid that we're reaching now we're coming very close to the end of this conference and the time we had ahead of us. So very briefly before we close, I will ask each one of you to summarize in just a couple of sentences the main message that you would like our audience to take home with them. And maybe we can start with you, Joachim Balke.
Really interesting discussion, but I think I would go back to what I said in the beginning. I think essentially what is needed is, on the one hand, clarity about the investment framework, and that means clarity in also what the framework is going to be in a medium to long term. Clarity about the, let's say, the level of ambition, because I think that is what's going to allow the industry to scale up its production capacities. That's why we also need to put some figures out there. And then thirdly, based on that clarity, a clear plan to roll out the grid. Basically, I haven't said before, but I would say in time for the generation to be able to deliver to the load centers. I think these remain the three key success factors.
Thank you, Giles Dixon. Maybe your final comments to summarize what you would like our audience to take home with them from this event.
Joachim is absolutely right, just to highlight the importance of scaling up the supply chain. Our factories today are capable of producing 7 gigawatts a year of offshore wind equipment. When we get into the 2030s, we need to be producing up to 18 gigawatts a year of turbines. We need lots of new factories. We need to be investing very heavily in our port infrastructure as well. All the equipment goes through ports. They need space, they need heavy loading quays, they need deep berths for the jack-up vessels. The recovery plan and the national recovery and resilience plans have a key role to play in facilitating investments in this sort of port, logistics, and supply chain infrastructure.
Thanks, Gerald Kindler. Your main message for today?
Thank you. Offshore is a truly European challenge, which I particularly enjoy. We have to look at 2 factors. One, it's offshore grid, and it's also integration of the offshore grid into the onshore grid to bring the electricity really to the customers. And then we have to look at the system perspective. It's not only sufficient to build the wind farms, but in addition, we have to truly integrate it into the system with sector coupling and sector integration. And at the end, it requires a lot of money, and we need a stable framework so it attracts the necessary equity and investors can get the necessary loans. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, Wojciech Dabrowski for the concluding words.
Well, thank you. We believe that offshore wind may be and should be a part of a broad plan for sea planning, taking into account other sectors. We also share the Commission's insight and further proposals aims at strengthening the European supply chain, including Polish enterprises and its competitiveness on global markets.
Thank you, Wojciech Dabrowski. I think this wraps up today's event. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. Thanks to PGE for supporting this event. And thanks to our panelists, of course, for joining us. We have many more virtual events related to energy and climate in the pipeline for the coming weeks and months. So please bear with us. Look at our website, events.euractiv.com, for the full program. We hope to see you soon again here. And we wish you a very good day. Stay safe and bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.